Taking to the streets, protesting, fighting for your rights. Sounds like something we're all too familiar with here in the United States, from civil rights protests to anti-Vietnam War protests to Tea Party protests. But you just saw how it's being done in France. And there are many who say, hey, that's how it's really done. Brian Becker is the national coordinator of Answer Coalition and joins us more to talk about this. And Brian, what do you think about these protests? Do you think when you look here that the protests that we see now in this day in the United States sort of pales in comparison?
Well, perhaps, but I think that the people in the United States, especially the labor movement, the civil rights movement, the 30 million people who are unemployed or underemployed, the millions of families who can't feed themselves when they get older and whose Social Security benefits have been reduced again this year as they were last year. And again, we have in the United States proposals like in France to raise the retirement age. I think people are going to be looking to France. Those who are the have-nots, those who are worried about their economic futures, are actually going to take heart in the protest, the militancy, the massive numbers that have come out in France. And don't forget, this comes just on the heels of the mass protests in Greece. There's a strong tradition that what happens in Europe also starts to take shape in North America, in the United States. That's happened in the 60s. It happened in the 30s. I think in this, the age of austerity, or what the bankers hope will be the age of austerity for working families, I think we'll see a lot of synergy here.
But, Brian, I mean, you just talked about the labor protests here in the United States, the civil rights protests. I mean, these were enormous and had a huge effect on change. Do you think that what we're seeing in terms of them being so much less aggressive here, do you think that has to do with this being a post-9/11 era and, you know, police can really arrest anybody easier now? Well,
I think there is more repression. I think people in the United States fear the government more. I think in the case of France, the government fears the people because of the tradition of radical protest. But there is, even though there's a difference and dissimilarity, there's a lot of continuity in these movements. You take the 30s or the 1960s, for instance, what started in Toledo, Ohio, or Minneapolis, Minnesota, or San Francisco, where there were general strikes that led to the passage of the 1935 Social Security Act. That's why we have Social Security. It was because of mass protest. The same thing started to happen in France and was generating massive radical outcomes. In 1968, France erupted in a near revolution where workers and students went out. If you look at 1968 in the United States, also the biggest year of mass protest. We're behind in the United States, but I believe it's coming. There was a protest of hundreds of thousands of workers and students right here in Washington, D.C. on October 2nd. It didn't get a lot of media. It wasn't as militant as what's happening in France, but that can catch up very quickly.
And I was at that protest, and certainly it didn't get as much media attention, but it was very well attended. One of the things I saw there, though, was it was attended by so many different groups, from unions to somebody who wanted to stop international abduction. You know, the issues, there were hundreds of issues. So I'm wondering what you think. Well, is there a leader? Is there somebody who will inspire protests to become radical enough to get the attention to make change? Because certainly we know we need change here in this country.
Well, in each of the great historical and social movements, new leaders come. Martin Luther King wasn't a well-known leader. He was a 26-year-old when the Montgomery bus boycott changed the South and changed America in 1955. I think what we're seeing in France, and I think what we'll see in the United States, is a new generation of leaders, not encumbered, maybe not tied to the old system, reflecting this deep felt need for jobs, for education, for an affordable life, and people who are threatened by what the bankers call the age of austerity. The bankers are making tens of billions of dollars every year in bonuses, but they tell the workers, we can't afford to have you have decent pensions. You have to tighten your belt. Meanwhile, the bankers aren't tightening their belts. So that contradiction is going to lead to class polarization and mass protests, not only in Europe, but I believe in the United States.
I thought it was interesting what you said, that in France, the government is afraid of the people, but in the United States, the people, in many respects, are afraid of the government. So how does that change? If you believe that these mass protests will happen here, what needs to change?
Well, there is a history in the United States of fierce repression. That's what happened in the 60s, for instance. Many people were killed. Many thousands of people went to jail. That happened in the 30s, too. There is a lot of repression. But when the people start to move, that repression, instead of becoming an intimidating factor, in fact becomes an escalator, an accelerant to more struggle, because people are angry that they're being denied their absolute constitutional rights to speak out, speak up, and redress grievances. So it's a test. At first, the people may be intimidated, but then, in fact, the repression leads to a greater radicalization, which becomes broader. That's how social movements start as small minority movements and become massive movements. And then later, we look back at them in history and say, oh, that was inevitable that that movement would come. But beforehand, we hardly see it. And I think that's what we're seeing in the United States, or what we saw in France a few months ago. The harbinger, small things, subterranean changes, and finally an eruption of a mass movement.
And you said what often happens in Europe then happens in the United States. What time frame, in your best guess, are we talking about?
Well, I think right now it's in the matter of the next year or 2 years that the labor movement, all of those who are really the dispossessed in America, and that's a growing legion of people, the poverty rate is at the highest ever, I think they will be propelled into action. Right now people are looking at the midterm elections, but afterwards I think all bets could be off.
All right, Brian Becker, National Coordinator for the Answer Coalition.